I remember the morning exactly because of the quality of the light and the sound of Dale Abernathy's laughter. It was Tuesday, May 12th. The sun wasn't yet up, but the sky over the prairie had gone from black to the color of old pewter, a flat, heavy gray that promised a cool day. There was a dampness in the air that you could feel in your bones, the kind that makes the hinges on the barn door complain. I was standing by the new enclosure, a patchwork of salvaged posts and cheap wire, and Dale had pulled his new Ford up to the fence line on his way to check his own fields. He leaned his elbow out the window, the engine rumbling, and he just laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh, not really. It was the sound of a man who cannot believe what he is seeing, a sound of pure, unadulterated bafflement. And in my head, I heard my grandmother's voice, a faint echo from a page in her journal, saying, "A hungry mouth pointed the right way is better than a sharp blade swung everywhere." I stood a little straighter. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? Dale killed the engine. The sudden silence made the peeping and honking from behind the wire seem 10 times louder. "Martha," he said, shaking his head slowly, a grin still playing on his lips. "I've seen you do some stubborn things in your time. Lord knows your father was the same. But this takes the cake. What in God's name are you going to do with 80 half-blind geese?" I didn't answer right away. I was watching them. They were Pomeranian buffs mostly, a few Emdens mixed in. The hatchery in Minnesota had been selling them off cheap. "A genetic quirk in the flock," the man on the phone had explained. "A kind of congenital cataract that left most of them with clouded, milky blue eyes. They could see shapes and light, but not much more. To him, they were a liability. To me, they were a possibility." "They look hungry, Dale," I said finally. "Well, of course they're hungry," he snorted. "They're geese. That's their natural state. What I mean is, what's the plan? You gonna sell them for Christmas? You're about 6 months early." He gestured with his chin toward the North 40, the 80-acre field that stretched out behind the enclosure. "And you've put them right up against your best wheat." That was the heart of it, of course, the North 40. It wasn't just a field. It was a legacy and a burden all in one. My grandfather broke the sod on that field with a team of mules. My father farmed it for 50 years. It has some of the best, deepest black soil in the whole county. Dark and rich, it'll grow anything you put in it. But it has a vulnerability. It's the highest piece of ground on our property, and the most exposed. The west wind hits it square on, with nothing to break its stride for 5 miles. And with that wind, for as long as I can remember, have come the grasshoppers. Every summer was the same battle. My father would walk the edges of that field in July, his face grim, watching the first tiny hoppers hatch in the ditches. He'd spray, of course. He used whatever the co-op recommended, malathion back in the day, then a whole series of chemicals with names I can't even pronounce. It was a costly, anxious business. Some years he won. Some years the hoppers took 10, 15 bushels an acre right off the top. He'd stand on the porch and watch the combines on the horizon, his jaw tight, and say, "They just eat and eat. There's no reasoning with them." After he passed, the field became my problem. I fought the same fight, writing checks to the chemical company, driving the sprayer myself, feeling that same knot of anxiety in my stomach from June to August. It felt like a war I was destined to lose, slowly. Then, last winter, during that cold snap in January, when the wind howled for 3 days straight, and the world outside the windows was nothing but a white blur. I finally decided to clean out the old trunk in the attic. It had been my mother's, and her mother's before that. It was filled with old linens, baptismal gowns, and at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was my grandmother Elspeth's daybook. It wasn't a diary, not really. She wasn't one for feelings. It was a record. Planting dates, rainfall totals, the price of eggs, a list of preserves she'd put up. And tucked into the back pages, a section from the 1930s. The Dust Bowl years, the grasshopper years. I'd read it before, but this time, one passage stood out. It was dated July 1936. "The hoppers are a plague from Scripture," she wrote in her neat, spidery cursive. "They have taken Miller's corn and stripped the bark from his saplings. The sky is brown with them. Abernathy's boy," that would have been Dale's grandfather, "is using the poison dust, but it only seems to make them angry. I will not have it on my land. The old ways are best. Tomorrow we move the walking fence to the north field." I kept reading. She went on to describe it. "A flock of geese, not penned in a yard, but managed on the field itself with temporary fencing. The trick," she wrote, "is in the birds themselves. The ones with poor sight are best. They do not wander, and they are not tempted by the sight of the green wheatheads. They stay low. They are nervous birds, and they listen more than they look. They hear the rustle and the click of the insects on the ground, and that is what they hunt. They are a living, moving wall of appetite. My father called them the walking fence. A hungry mouth pointed the right way is better than a sharp blade swung everywhere." There it was. Not a trick, but a system. A whole philosophy in a single sentence. I sat there in the dusty attic, the wind rattling the window panes, and I held that 80-year-old wisdom in my hands. I'd known about the journal for years, of course. My mother had shown it to me once, but I'd dismissed it. It was a curiosity, a piece of family history. It wasn't a farm manual. The world had moved on. We had science now. We had chemicals and GPS and yield monitors. But standing there at the fence line, with Dale Abernathy's kind, pitying smile fixed on me, I realized science hadn't solved the problem on the North 40. It had only made the fight more expensive. I'd hesitated for months. The idea felt foolish, even to me. It was one thing to read about it in a journal, another to spend real money, to become the talk of the county. I finally broke down and called my brother Thomas. He runs the hardware store in town. He's a practical man, not given to flights of fancy. I laid it all out for him on the phone one evening, expecting him to laugh like Dale had. But he didn't. He was silent for a long time. Then he just asked, "How much?" "The geese are cheap," I told him. $15 a head, $1,200 for the lot. The fencing is the real cost, and the water. "Not the money, Martha," he said. "I mean, how much work? How are you going to keep them contained on 80 acres? Geese can be hell on wheels to move. And what about coyotes? An owl will take a gosling in a heartbeat." He didn't ask why, he asked how. And that was the only permission I needed. His practical questions gave the idea weight, moved it from a grandmother's fantasy to a logistical problem. We talked for an hour. We drew up a plan. I'd use electric poultry netting, the kind used for rotational grazing of chickens. I could buy it in 164-foot rolls. It would take at least 10 rolls to make a decent-sized paddock. I could power it with a solar charger. For water, I'd use 50-gallon barrels fitted with poultry nipple drinkers, mounted on an old hay wagon I could pull with the tractor. For predators, I'd need to be vigilant. 2 good farm dogs and a shotgun. The day after my call with Thomas, I went out and walked the North 40. I didn't take the truck. I walked it, corner to corner. It was early April, the ground just beginning to thaw. I carried a soil probe and a small notebook, just like Elspeth. I took samples, not for the university to analyze, but for me. I crumbled the dark soil in my fingers, smelled its earthy, damp scent. I noted the low spots where water would naturally pool after a rain, the slight rises in the terrain. I saw the way the drainage ditch along the western edge was already thick with the dried husks of last year's weeds, a perfect nursery for grasshopper eggs. I realized then what my grandmother had understood. The field wasn't a uniform grid to be blanketed with a single solution. It was a landscape. It had contours, habits, tendencies. The problem wasn't the whole field, not all at once. The problem started at the edges and worked its way in. The solution, therefore, also had to start at the edges. My plan had been to just turn the geese loose in a big enclosure. But walking the ground, I saw that was wrong. I needed to control them, to concentrate their impact where it was needed most. I would start them on that western edge, in a long, narrow paddock right over the ditch. I would let them clean it out, strip it bare of the first green shoots and the insects that came with them. Then I would move the whole operation, the fence, the water wagon, the geese, 10 yards east, and then another 10, and another. I wouldn't be farming wheat and geese. I would be managing a slow-moving, hungry wave across the surface of my land. It wasn't a trick. It was a system. And the hard part, I could see now, wasn't buying the geese. It was the daily, repetitive, unglamorous work of moving the fence. It was the commitment to a process that would take the entire summer. A process that would look, from the road, like madness. The geese were the easy part. The patience was the hard part. After that walk, I made the call to the hatchery in Minnesota. I ordered 80 Pomeranian buff goslings, sight unseen, or rather, sight impaired. Then I drove to the farm supply store, not the big co-op, but the smaller, independent one 2 towns over, where they still sell things like loose bolts and single rolls of wire. I bought 10 rolls of the electric poultry netting. It cost me $89 a roll, $890. I bought a solar fence charger for $212, and 100 T-posts for $4 apiece. My checkbook cried. The day the goslings arrived, it was May. They came in 4 large flat boxes, peeping loud enough to be heard over the mail carrier's truck engine. I opened the boxes in the brooder house I'd set up in the old milk barn. A wave of warm, downy yellow spilled out. They were tiny, clumsy, and utterly dependent. For the first 4 weeks, they were my life. I kept them under heat lamps, made sure their food was clean and their water fresh. I spent hours just sitting with them, letting them get used to my voice, my presence. Their little blue-filmed eyes would follow my movement. They were, as the man had said, mostly blind, but their hearing was sharp. A dropped feed scoop would send them into a panicked chorus of peeps. When they were big enough, with their adult feathers starting to come in, I moved them to the enclosure by the North 40. That was the morning Dale Abernathy found me. His laughter was the community's first official response to my project, and it wouldn't be the last. The first few weeks with the geese on the pasture were a lesson in humility. The system I'd designed on paper met the messy reality of 80 living creatures. Moving the fence was even harder than I'd imagined. It took me the better part of 3 hours every other day. I'd have to turn off the charger, reel in the lines, pull the posts, move them 100 feet over, drive them back in, and unreel the lines again, making sure nothing was shorting out. The geese at first were confused. They'd huddle in a corner, honking in protest. I had to herd them, walking slowly behind them, talking to them in a low voice. Slowly, they learned the routine. The sound of the T-post driver became their signal. They knew that a new patch of green ground was coming. My brother Thomas came out one Sunday to help. He didn't say much, just picked up a post driver and went to work. We worked in silence for an hour, the rhythmic thud of the drivers the only sound. "You know," he said, wiping sweat from his brow, "Dad would think you were crazy." "I know," I said. "But Grandma Elspeth," he continued, a small smile on his face, "she'd be proud." He looked at the geese, which were now fanned out across the new paddock, their heads down, gobbling up weeds and whatever insects were hidden there. "It's working, isn't it?" "It seems to be," I said. "It's slow, but it's working." The wheat in the North 40 grew tall and green. By mid-June, it was a beautiful sight, a sea of emerald green rippling in the wind. My geese, meanwhile, were a noisy, messy, ambulatory blot on the landscape, a creeping line of disruption moving slowly eastward across the field's western flank. From the road, it looked bizarre. A pristine field of wheat, and then this chaotic zone of birds and wire. The talk in town was colorful. I heard secondhand that I was that goose lady. I was letting the place go. The real test came in late June. A white pickup truck from the Red River Grain Co-op pulled into my driveway. Out stepped Mr. Jansen, a man I'd known for years, a man whose personality was as starched as his company polo shirt. He was carrying a clipboard, which is never a good sign. "Martha," he said, foregoing any pleasantries, "got a call, a concern." "Hello, Bill," I said. "A concern about what?" "About your wheat crop on the North 40, he said, his eyes scanning past me toward the field. He could see the white specks of the geese, hear their distant chorus. "We have a contract with you, Martha. Grade A hard red spring wheat. There are standards. We can't have contaminants." "Contaminants?" I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. "Fowl excrement, for one," he said, making a note on his clipboard. "Feathers, not to mention the potential for disease transmission. E. coli, salmonella. If our inspectors find any evidence of animal contamination in the grain, we'd have to reject the whole lot, the whole 80 acres. I took a deep breath. "Bill, the geese are not in the wheat. They are on a paddock system, on the edge of the field. They are eating weeds and insects. They are nowhere near the grain heads." He looked skeptical. "It's an unconventional method, Martha, highly unconventional. The co-op board values innovation, but this is a risk, a big one. You're jeopardizing your contract, not just for this year, but potentially for the future." He wasn't threatening me, not exactly. He was just stating the facts as he saw them. He was a man who believed in manuals and regulations, not in the journals of dead grandmothers. "I understand the risk," I said, my voice flatter than I intended. "Do you?" he asked. He pointed with his pen toward Dale Abernathy's land across the road. "Dale just invested in a new GPS-guided sprayer, variable rate application. He can target a 5-square-foot patch of weeds from the comfort of an air-conditioned cab. That's the future of farming, Martha. Not this." He waved his hand vaguely in the direction of my noisy, feathered workforce. He left me with a formal written warning, a piece of paper that said, in bureaucratic language, that I was on my own. If this failed, the co-op would wash its hands of me. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The house was too quiet, and the sounds from outside were too loud. The hum of the fence charger, the occasional disgruntled honk from the flock, the whisper of the wind in the wheat, which now sounded less like a promise and more like a taunt. I got out of bed and walked through the dark house to the living room. I pulled out Elspeth's journal. The pages were thin and brittle, and they smelled of dust and time. I found the passage again, my finger tracing her elegant, determined script. I read it aloud to the empty room. "A hungry mouth pointed the right way is better than a sharp blade swung everywhere." Had she felt this doubt? The night before she moved her walking fence, had she lain awake, listening to the drone of the insects, wondering if she was a fool? The journal didn't say. It only recorded the work, the doing. It didn't record the worrying. Maybe that was the lesson. Trust the process. Trust the observation. The feelings of doubt are just weather. They pass. The work remains. I closed the book, went back to bed, and this time I slept. I had to be up at dawn to move the fence. July turned into August. The heat settled in, thick and suffocating. The sky took on a hazy, bleached-out look. The wheat began to turn from green to gold, the heads heavy and full. Every other day, I moved my flock. They were a well-oiled machine now, if a machine could be feathered and ill-tempered. They knew the routine. They were sleek and heavy, no longer gawky goslings, but powerful birds. And the North 40 was changing. I could see it clearly from the cab of my old tractor. On one side of the Geese's ever-moving paddock, the wheat stood clean and tall. The ground beneath it was clear. On the other side, the western side they had already covered, the ground was clipped short, almost like a lawn. But it was also clean. The real difference was on the other side of the property line. Dale Abernathy's fields, for all his technology, were humming. In the stillness of the late afternoon, you could stand at the fence and hear it, a low, constant, crackling hum. The sound of millions of grasshoppers chewing. He'd been spraying. I'd seen the big rig out at dawn and dusk, but the hoppers were relentless this year. The county extension agent had put out a bulletin. The hot, dry spring had led to a massive hatch. They were predicting the worst outbreak in 20 years. My field was quiet. I'd walk the perimeter in the evenings, my dogs trotting beside me. On Dale's side of the fence, the air was alive with jumping insects. They'd fly up in a cloud with every step. On my side, nothing. A few stray hoppers, maybe, but they didn't last long. The geese were thorough. Their poor eyesight and sharp hearing made them perfect for the job. They weren't distracted by the waving wheatheads. They were tuned to the frequency of the ground, to the rustle and click of insect life. They were a living, breathing, targeted insecticide. Then the news reports started. First from Oklahoma, then Kansas, then Nebraska. They were calling them locusts now, not just grasshoppers. When their population reaches a certain density, they change. Their bodies change. Their brains change. They become a swarm. A single superorganism with one purpose: to move and to eat. The television showed brown clouds boiling over the horizon, descending on fields and leaving behind nothing but bare earth. The reports tracked their movement north, carried on the prevailing southerly winds. They were a week away, then 3 days, then 1. The day they came was August 21st. I remember the sky. It was the color of a bruised peach, hazy and yellowed with dust. The air was unnaturally still and quiet. Even the geese were subdued, huddled together near their water wagon. Around noon, I saw it. A darkness on the southern horizon. It wasn't a cloud. It moved too fast, and it had a texture to it, like smoke, but thicker, more alive. I stood on my porch and watched it come. There was nothing to be done. No sprayer, no chemical, no technology could stop what was coming. It was biblical. It was nature at its most terrible and magnificent. The sound started first, a low, deep hum that grew into a roar. The sound of billions of tiny wings and chewing mouths. It was the sound of complete consumption. The swarm hit Dale's fields first. The darkness descended, and the air filled with the frantic, clicking roar. I couldn't see his house, his barns, anything, just a churning brown mass. It was terrifying. I went inside and closed the door, but I couldn't shut out the sound. It felt like the end of the world. I sat at my kitchen table, my hands shaking, and I waited. The sound went on for what felt like an eternity, an hour, maybe 2. And then, as gradually as it began, it started to fade. The roar subsided to a hum, and then to a whisper. The light outside my window brightened. I opened the door and stepped out. The air smelled strange, acrid and dusty. The ground was coated in a thick layer of locusts, but they were moving, rising up, joining the main swarm as it continued its inexorable march north. I looked across the road. Dale's fields were gone. Not just the wheat, everything. They were stripped bare, down to the dirt. The ground was a uniform, desolate brown. It looked like it had been burned. My heart ached for him. A year's work, a lifetime of investment, erased in 2 hours. Then I turned and looked at my own land, at the North 40. The swarm had passed over it. They had landed, yes. The ground around my house was covered. But the field of wheat was still there. It was standing. It was golden. From a distance, it looked completely untouched. I walked, almost in a trance, toward the field. The geese were making a racket, a triumphant, angry honking. As I got closer, I saw why. The swarm had avoided the main body of the wheat. The edges of the field, where the geese had been, were a zone of chaos. The geese were in a frenzy, snapping up the remaining locusts, stomping, honking. They had created a buffer, a zone of noise and disturbance, and, most importantly, a lack of existing food. The locusts, Sensing this disturbance, and finding no easy meal of smaller grasshoppers on the perimeter, had largely passed over, seeking an easier, quieter place to feast. They had flowed around my field like water around a stone. The next few days were a blur of official vehicles. The county commissioner came, the state agricultural department, and then a young man from the university, an entomologist named Dr. Aris Thorne. He was everything you'd expect: young, bright, skeptical, and armed with a dazzling array of equipment. He had insect nets, acoustic sensors, soil samplers, and a drone. He was here to study the anomaly. My field was now an official anomaly. He spent 3 days on my property. He was polite but distant. He was a man of data, and I was just the strange old woman who owned the data set. He walked the perimeter just as I had. He took samples from my field and from the barren wasteland of dales. He measured everything: insect density per square meter, plant biomass, soil compaction. He even put tiny microphones near the geese to record their decibel levels. On the 3rd evening, he came to my door, his face sunburned, his notebook full of figures. "Mrs. Nelson," he said, and he sounded tired. "I have to be honest. I don't have a model for this." "A model for what?" I asked, handing him a glass of iced tea. "For this," he said, gesturing to the field. "The data is, well, it's anomalous. Your pest density, even before the main swarm arrived, was 2 orders of magnitude lower than the control fields." "The control fields?" "Your neighbor's land," he clarified. "We've been monitoring grasshopper populations across the county all season. Your numbers were negligible. Then the swarm came. Based on our models, based on everything we know about swarm dynamics, your field should be gone. It's high ground, it's prime forage. It was directly in the path of the main body." He took a long drink of tea. "But it's not good."